My name is David Brown. I have a blog called The Trendy Troodon where I review movies, among other things. And for this video, I'm going to talk about a movie called Picture Mommy Dead, sometimes Color Mommy Dead, which was a better title, but this is what's in the video. And what's going to be interesting about it is that it's a movie by Bert I Gordon, who is best known for science fiction and fantasy. I'll be getting to that. Uh, and this, I would say, is his best movie for reasons I'll be going into. And a big part of that is that it's very different from his body of work. And I will mention, I've double checked, Bert I Gordon is still alive. He's pretty close to turning 100. So that's certainly something to be glad for. Unfortunately, one of his children, Susan Gordon, is deceased and has been for a while. And she is the star of this movie and several other Bert I Gordon movies. Now, getting into Bert I Gordon stuff, if you are at all into bad movies, 50s movies, B movies, this guy was one of the more notorious directors. Uh, he usually would produce too, so you could call him a filmmaker. Uh, he really didn't even necessarily do a lot of stuff or particularly bad stuff, but it was still 1950s to 60s B movies. And the big joke about him uh, was that he was called Mr. Big because people would say all his films were about either giant creatures that had mutated or somehow been blown up to giant size, or people being shrunk and then dealing with giant, what were to them giant creatures and objects. Uh, and he'd do that with what they'd call process shots, which were getting low budget or outdated even in the 50s and especially into the 60s. That really wasn't that fair. If you really look at all the stuff he did, he had a very diverse body of work. He did some kids' movies that were adventures, maybe historical, but not necessarily with fantasy or science fiction. He did some horror movies and he did some dramas. He even tried branching out into a sex comedy called How to Succeed with Sex. That I was impressed. When I went looking for it, this was what I call unmovie territory. It was never banned, there was no copyright dispute to tie it up, but you just cannot find it, especially in anything like an authorized format. I had a lead on someone who claimed to be able to offer what was clearly a bootleg of this, uh, but it's not there on any of the online outlets, at least that are above board enough to show up in search results. Yeah, that's a movie. It's like the universe does not want it to be seen. Now, with this movie, this was where he was definitely trying the hardest to branch out, and that does show in the quality. It had a big budget, some pretty big names. At one point, they were getting Audrey Hepburn to play the murder victim here. They ended up with Zsa Zsa Gabor. There's some others who were clearly, if not major names, at least polished actors. And it starred Susan Gordon in just about her last film. And it was also as close as she got to an adult role. She's still a child, but she would have been 16 or 17. I had looked into that at one point, but I couldn't say offhand. And uh, it also just has obviously high production values with sets, props. There's even a room full of toys. Some of this stuff really looks like it might have been shot in an actual house, uh, but it does look like a very nice, expensive house. And so the whole setup of the movie is that there's a girl whose mother had died a night the house caught fire, so people don't really know if she died by accident, suicide, or murder. And the girl is sent to what's implied to be an insane asylum, though they make it look more like a convent or an orphanage. They show a nun who ran it. And then when the girl comes home, the two big complications are that she controls her mother's inheritance, and there's a piece of very valuable jewelry that's been missing that her mother owns. So there's different people scheming either to get the girl out of the way, or at least either get on her good side or find some of the stuff, especially the jewelry. So it's set up as a mystery or drama. People still call it supernatural horror, but it isn't really, and that is definitely what's unique and interesting. Now, Bert I Gordon hadn't done all science fiction or fantasy, uh, and he'd done one film called Tormented that was kind of psychological horror also. It's a guy who's seeing a woman whose death he caused a little indirectly, haunting him. They set it up as ambiguous whether it's real or in his head. So here they just went further in that direction. You can call it psychological horror, but there's really nothing that's supernatural or even suggestive of the supernatural. And again, this was also definitely an adult-oriented movie, so it wasn't an adventure for kids either, even with a person who had been a child actor. And the problem, certainly the biggest issue you could take, is that the mystery isn't really much of a mystery. They kind of set it up to make you think, or think they're trying to make you think that the girl killed her mother, that is. But it's really very obvious that she doesn't. That I would not consider a spoiler. And even at one point she says, I did it, or I might have done it. You can tell at that point even more she isn't the one who did it. And there's some others where you can tell they weren't the murderer just because it's obvious that they don't know what's going on. Especially there's a woman who's now the girl's stepmother, who was her governess, caretaker, and she's the one really out to find the jewel. And then there's another guy who had been unrequitedly in love with the girl's mother, and then her current stepmother obviously wants to get involved with him, but he's not interested. So they have their own schemes that they're chasing around, and with those two especially, and a few other characters, even if they're not the murderer, they're the ones who are obviously dangerous to themselves and each other, as well as the girl, that finally ends up with at least one additional murderer from the plotters turning on each other. And what is finally revealed isn't really a surprise, but it's still well done. And at that point, the girl is really creepier than the characters who you know are the murderers. And what's most interesting about this is that it kind of anticipates some 70s trends that I really hate, especially what I call random editing. Have a bunch of images that are shocking or weird and make that look like you're showing either the supernatural realm or someone going crazy. That I just think of as a disability self-advocate, as a sane person's idea of madness. Here, you can see the beginnings of that trend, but it's actually pretty well done. There's especially a shot of a room full of toys that shows one toy after another getting increasingly menacing, like a close-up of a wolf that's goofy but also definitely creepy. And so that gets more like psychological horror, but it's still pretty linear. They aren't just being random for the sake of random. And there's plenty more like that. I would hate it normally, but again, it's done much better than usual here. And that really covers what I wanted to say about the movie. Overall, as I've said, Bert I Gordon is definitely an underrated filmmaker up to a point. But part of that was for himself to blame. Part of that was that when he was trying to branch out, the people in the mainstream weren't giving him as much recognition as he deserved. And if he does stay around for a while longer, I just say happy birthday. So I'm going to sign out of this video. As I've said, watch something good, or at least something interesting. This is definitely in that zone.